In 1886, Karl Marx stated that social progress can be measured exactly by the social position of the fair sex. While usage of the term the fair sex may not have aged quite as well as Marx intended, it shows that from the beginning of Marxist theorization, there's always been an interest in supporting the emancipation of women, particularly with Marx's co-author to the Communist Manifesto, Friedrich Engels. And this support, of course, is upheld by all principled Marxists to this day. But with that being said, there are certain differences between how Marxists conceive of women's oppression and how bourgeois or petty bourgeois feminist theorists conceive of it, particularly with regard to understanding the root cause of patriarchal oppression and what this means for emancipation. So what is the Marxist understanding of women's oppression? Where does this patriarchal oppression come from? And how can emancipation from this be achieved? Let's find out. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an ML and MLM perspective with short and easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. If you'd like to support Marxist educational content, then toss €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon to help keep this series going. If you're not in a position to support financially, you can help out by sharing these videos around on social media. Now, patriarchy is a mode of oppression that spanned across all forms of class society, from slave society through feudalism and up to the modern day in capitalism. Patriarchal oppression is visible in virtually all aspects of society's superstructure, from the family to our systems of law, our cultures, and so on. But while patriarchal oppression exists today, and its ubiquity is unfortunately taken for granted by many, this wasn't always the case. In fact, for more than 95% of the time that anatomically modern human beings have been on this planet, the institution of patriarchy simply didn't exist. So what changed in this recent 5% of humanity's existence? How did women come to be oppressed under patriarchy? What's the cause of this oppression? While some erroneously attribute the root cause of women's oppression to being some ahistorical, mystical, deficient feminine nature, and others attempt to locate the source of women's oppression narrowly in biology, Catalina Adrianzen of the Movimiento Femenino Popular offers the Marxist explanation for the source of patriarchal oppression. According to this historical materialist perspective, the root of women's oppression is private property and the subjugation of women that began with it. Private property itself, then, is the basis for the patriarchal oppression of women, meaning that if we truly seek the complete emancipation of women, the only way to achieve this in its totality is to abolish the root cause of women's oppression, private property, in stateless, classless, moneyless society. Now, why do we say that private property is the root cause of women's oppression? In order to understand this, we need to go back in time and look at the transition period between primitive communal society and class society. In The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, Friedrich Engels refers to these three periods as 1. Savagery, which is primitive communist hunter-gatherer society, 2. Barbarism, which is the aforementioned transitional stage that introduces pastoralism and agriculture, and 3. Civilization, which is class society beginning with slave society, then feudalism, and now capitalism. Corresponding to each stage is a different form of marriage between people and groups of people. In primitive communist savagery, group marriage among and between large groups of people is the norm. There was no institutionalized form of patriarchy at this stage, and no prohibitions between who could and couldn't have relations with one another. In barbarism, the transitional stage between primitive communism and class society, there's a move away from large-scale group marriage as more and more restrictions are placed on incestuous relationships, and now smaller-scale pairing marriage begins to dominate. This is the stage where we begin to see the emergence of patriarchy. Friedrich Engels states that, in this stage, one man lives with one woman, but the relationship is such that polygamy and occasional infidelity remain the right of the men, even though for economic reasons polygamy is rare, while from the woman the strictest fidelity is generally demanded throughout the time she lives with the man, and adultery on her part is cruelly punished. The marriage tie can, however, be easily dissolved by either partner. After separation, the children still belong as before to the mother alone. Note that last part about children belonging to the mother when separation occurs. This is a remnant from primitive communism's group marriages wherein people would have multiple sexual partners. This made it often impossible to tell who the biological father of the child was, and this wasn't a concern in a communal environment anyway, as the children were raised collectively. The only thing that could be certain here was that the mother gave birth to the child. Therefore, the mother was afforded what's sometimes referred to as mother right due to the definite biological connection there. Consequently, kinship was traced through the mother's line, matrilineage, rather than the father's, and women held higher positions in society as a result. And this mother right remained in the pairing marriages of barbarism as primitive communism's group marriages slowly died out. But something changed during barbarism as class society began to emerge. With the rise of the pairing marriage, we begin to see a move away from communal ownership of property and towards private ownership. We see the development of agriculture and pastoralism, which begin to produce a surplus that isn't necessarily held collectively, but often privately. We see a division of labour emerge wherein it was the man's part to obtain food and the instruments of labour necessary for the purpose. He therefore also owned the instruments of labour, and in the event of husband and wife separating, he took them with him just as she retained her household goods. Therefore, according to the social custom of the time, the man was also the owner of the new source of subsistence, the cattle, and later the new instruments of labour, the slaves. But according to the custom of the same society, his children could not inherit from him. Cattle were breeding and wealth was growing relatively rapidly, far beyond the needs of those in the household. As a result of having more food than was immediately necessary with the advent of agriculture and pastoralism, now slaves could be taken and kept alive indefinitely. These slaves had children and this labour force grew. With more food, more cattle and more slaves, with the rise of this new surplus, men in particular grew wealthier and their position within the family became more and more important. But while the matrilineal mother right remained, there was no way for him to pass on his private property to the next generation. What would become of his slaves, his cattle, and so on? Inheritance occurred almost exclusively along the mother's lines. The only way for this private property to be passed down to a man's children to continue to accumulate was if mother right was overthrown and in its place was put a patrilineal system. This would facilitate inheritance based on the male line and allow accumulation of private property to span across generations, eventually flourishing into full empires. And that's exactly what happened. The overthrow of mother right was the world historical defeat of the female sex. The man took command in the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. The patriarchal family was thus born with the successful subjugation of women. In order to ensure that the children who would inherit private property were biologically connected to the father, the pairing marriage transformed into the monogamous marriage. This brings us to the beginning of class society, from barbarism to the beginnings of civilization, to slave society, all in the name of the accumulation of private property. Monogamous marriage is based on the supremacy of the man, the express purpose being to produce children of undisputed paternity. Such paternity is demanded because these children are later to come into their father's property as his natural heirs. It is distinguished from pairing marriage by the much greater strength of the marriage tie, which can no longer be dissolved at either partner's wish. As a rule, it is now only the man who can dissolve it and put away his wife. The monogamous marriage, the permanent patriarchal form which facilitates the accumulation of property, is seen clearly in ancient Greek slave society, developing in intensity and becoming more and more generalised geographically as the centuries pass. And this of course could only be facilitated and generalised with the development of the slave state, which enforced private property relations and male supremacy, violently punishing all those who challenged it in any way. This continued with the feudal state and continues today with the capitalist state, each form of state of course manifesting with its own unique characteristics. Patriarchy and the patriarchal family exist to this day to facilitate inheritance and the accumulation of capital, as well as for the reproduction of labour. In other words, to protect and grow private property and to ensure that people are able to labour with that private property in order to further accumulate capital for the ruling class. Anyone who impedes this process is punished accordingly, and the two groups that are incentivized most to fight back against this, the two groups whose freedom is inherently at odds with this state of affairs, are women and LGBT+ people. Hence, it's important to note that patriarchy is a two-pronged mode of oppression affecting not only women, but also LGBT+ people. So, with this understanding of private property and its accumulation as the basis for patriarchal oppression, what is the position of the communist movement on, to use some old-fashioned language, the women's question? Mao voiced the communist position of absolute and unwavering support for women's emancipation when he stated that The emancipation of women is an integral part of the liberation of the proletariat, but also specifically that genuine equality between the sexes can only be realised in the process of the socialist transformation of society as a whole. This in no way should be misinterpreted to mean that we shouldn't address the daily demands of women and others suffering under patriarchal oppression in the here and now. Instead, it's a recognition that the only way to achieve complete and total emancipation is by transitioning to stateless, classless, moneyless society and abolishing the private property from which patriarchal oppression flows. To this end, the women's movement has to be integrated into the wider struggle to abolish class society led by the most politically advanced proletarian women. As Lenin stated, we say that the emancipation of workers must be brought about by the workers themselves, and similarly, the emancipation of women workers must be brought about by the women workers themselves. On that point, it's necessary to emphasise that communist support for the complete emancipation of women necessarily includes both cis and trans women, rejecting bourgeois anti-Marxist biological determinism and metaphysical materialist conceptions of what constitutes womanhood. As Catalina Adrianzen states, for Marxism, women as much as men are but a set of social relations, historically adapted and changing as a function of the changes of society in its development process. Today we've taken a look at the Marxist understanding of women's oppression and emancipation. We began by delineating the Marxist basis for patriarchal oppression, private property. We then looked at how the accumulation of private property historically necessitated the establishment of patriarchy with the patriarchal monogamous family in order to facilitate inheritance patrilineally. Understanding this root cause of the patriarchal mode of oppression which oppresses women and LGBT+ people, we then proceeded to explain the communist position of complete support for the emancipation from patriarchy. Emancipation can only be fully achieved when the root cause of patriarchal oppression, private property, is abolished. Therefore, the women's movement must be fully integrated with the proletarian movement for stateless, classless, moneyless society. Now, it's one thing for communists to support women's emancipation in theory, but it's another thing entirely to actually put that into practice. Unfortunately, the communist movement has too often failed to protect women and LGBT+ people from patriarchal violence and oppression, even within the ranks of communist organisations themselves. This has to be rectified immediately and unequivocally. To that end, I'm giving you homework. Read on Standards of Feminist Conduct from the Centre for Marxist-Leninist Maoist Studies. Do it now right after this video. It's only a short article and it's easy to read. Circulate it widely in your organisations. Ideally, hold a study session where you and your comrades read through this article together, discussing and analysing it, and most importantly, working out how to apply this to your own organisational practice in adherence with proletarian feminist standards. If you're still unsure what proletarian feminism is exactly, read the article What is Proletarian Feminism for a concise, up-to-date overview. Again, organise study groups in your organisations to flesh this out and apply it to your own context. Now, these are both recent texts dealing very much with the modern world, but there are another few texts that I'd also recommend diving into to develop your theoretical and historical understanding of proletarian feminism. First in this regard, I strongly recommend Anuradha Gandhi's Philosophical Trends in the Feminist Movement, which provides useful criticisms of bourgeois and petty bourgeois class collaborationist strands of feminism like liberal feminism and so-called radical feminism. Second, Catalina Adrianzen's Marxism, Mariátegui and the Women's Movement provides a fantastic overview of the women's movement from the Marxist perspective. It draws heavily on Friedrich Engels on the origins of the family, private property and the state, another absolutely essential text for understanding the historical roots of patriarchy. Other important works include Alexandra Kollontái's The Social Basis of the Woman Question, as well as Clara Zetkin's Lenin on the Women's Question. All are linked in the description box below, as well as further useful resources such as podcasts, blogs, articles and more. Right, thanks very much for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. Thanks especially to the supporters on Patreon who've made this possible. Thank you Southern Comrade, Potato God 777, Ian McShay, Ugopnik, Ian Snyder, Jacob Chaff, Boraku Gorilla, Ryan Hodgson, Soup, Madeline, Sonic232, Sagan, Michaela Schmid, Christian Nepales, Alfonso Dingo Torres, Mekalova, Rock Artist, Todd Sprang, Nika the Sage, Zakassi, Anglo-Irish Bolshevik, Amy Schmidt, Eli Leslie, Thomas Ross and Wood, Bobby Block, Jason Schmidt, Del Siebold, Train H13, Mitch Schiller, Saoirse Ní Bhealán, Roja, MLM in Practice, Brian Ruse, Eric Lindahl, ZK Goody, Coyle Rapp, Robert Jerzak, Doc Toma, Oyub Farah, Becky, Pastor Schubert, Mr. Miyamoto, Coyle King, Reverend Lon Nom Hollywood, Wonderbad, JT Chapman, Joseph Shepard, Jack Schneidman, Comrade Amara, Wealth for the 99%, and Spoop. Cheers everyone, agus slán fóil, enjoy the article.